Welcome to the Public Housing Repositioning Post-Closing How-To video series. The goal of this video series is to help explain and discuss common issues that occur post-closing after repositioning public housing assets to voucher assistance. Each video provides quick guidance to public housing agencies, PHAs, that are new to or unfamiliar with rental assistance demonstration, RAD, and/or project-based voucher, PBV, program requirements. The video will help PHAs better understand their asset management and reporting responsibilities post-repositioning. The videos provide information to PHAs that have converted their assistance from public housing to voucher assistance as part of repositioning. This video will outline PHA responsibilities to support resident organizations once they have closed a RAD PBV transaction. While some videos in this series highlight program features that are applicable to both RAD PBVs and non-RAD PBVs, this video describes requirements only applicable to RAD PBVs. Introduction. This video covers 4 major topics including: what is a resident organization? How much funding do resident organizations receive? What is included in the written agreement? Resolving conflict between the resident organization and project owner. This video is intended to be a quick summary. All of the information presented in this video can be found in the most recent HUD notice on the guidance on the use of tenant participation funds. Check it out for more detail and information on the topic. What is a resident organization? Residents of covered projects where assistance is converted to the PBV program have the right to establish and operate a resident organization. The resident organization is designed to address issues related to their living environment. This may include the terms and conditions of their tenancy, as well as activities related to housing and community development. The PHA, or project owner, must recognize a legitimate resident organization and consider concerns raised by legitimate resident organizations. To be considered a legitimate resident organization, it must meet the following 5 criteria. 1. A resident organization is legitimate if the residents of a covered project have established it. 2. It meets regularly. 3. It operates democratically. 4. It is representative of all residents in the project. 5. And is entirely independent of the project owner, management, and their representatives. For example, this might look like a group of residents who meet monthly with representatives from each floor of the building and follow a meeting agenda where time to speak is allotted fairly and there are specific rules about voting on issues. The group may choose to use simple majority rules when it comes to voting or a 2/3 approval for certain kinds of votes. It is important that residents have full autonomy over the group and it is not influenced or co-opted by the project owner or PHA. In the absence of a legitimate resident organization at a covered project, HUD encourages the project owner and residents to work together to determine the most appropriate ways to foster a constructive working relationship, including supporting the formation of a legitimate resident organization. Residents are encouraged to contact the project owner directly with questions or concerns regarding issues related to their tenancy. Project owners are also encouraged to actively engage residents in the absence of a resident organization. How much funding do resident organizations receive? Now we will look at where the money comes from to support a resident organization's budget. As a general rule, PHAs and project owners have an obligation to financially support legitimate resident organizations. PHAs and project owners must provide $25 per occupied unit annually for resident participation activities. The $25 per unit is then split for 2 different purposes. $15 goes to the legitimate resident organization, and the other $10 goes to the PHA or project owner to support resident participation activities. Remember, a PHA or project owner can choose to offer more than $15 per unit to the resident organizations. However, they are still responsible for supporting tenant participation activities. So let's look at an example of what this means for a resident organization's annual budget. For example, a 100-unit building with all units occupied for the full calendar year, the total amount set aside for resident participation activities is $2,500. Of this, at least $1,500 must be provided to the resident organization. This means the resident organization budget is $1,500 for the year. The remaining $1,000 can be used by the PHA or project owner to support resident participation activities. If all of that falls into place, that is great. But what happens to the funds if there is no resident organization or one is formed at the end of the year? If there is no duly elected resident organization, HUD still encourages the project owner to inform residents of the availability of funds and to use up to $10 per unit per year to carry out tenant participation activities, including training and building resident capacity to establish and operate a resident organization. If a duly elected resident organization is formed during the funding year, the project owner must provide the resident organization with a minimum of $15 per unit per year to fund resident activities. These amounts must be available for this purpose for the entire funding year. At the end of the funding year, if a duly elected resident organization has not been formed, the project owner may use the remaining tenant participation amounts for resident participation activities for any eligible operating expense. Now that we know how much money a resident organization might receive and what happens to the funds, we will look at how that money can be spent. In general, the funds must be used according to the requirements of the written agreement. What is included in the written agreement? For starters, a written agreement between the PHA and the resident organization is required. The agreement establishes the relationship between the PHA and resident organization regarding funds and governs decisions on how those funds are budgeted, dispersed, and audited. HUD encourages PHAs and resident organizations to develop agreements that establish a collaborative partnership, provide flexibility, and support autonomy of the resident organizations. At a minimum, the written agreement must include details about the following: require the resident organization to submit a budget to request and receive funds. Require the resident organization to provide assurance that all expenditures comply with all relevant provisions of law and will promote serviceability, efficiency, economy, and stability in the operation of the local development. Require the resident organization to account to the PHA for the use of the funds. Require the resident organization to permit the PHA to inspect and audit the resident organization's financial records related to the agreement. In addition, HUD recommends as a best practice that the written agreement describe how proposed fund requests will be evaluated, describe the method and timing of disbursements, describe any agreements for transfers of funding to either jurisdiction-wide councils or resident organizations at other developments, describe specific legal, conflict of interest, procurement, and/or insurance requirements. Describe the PHA's process for inspecting and auditing the resident organization's financial records. Describe the minimum records needed for an audit. Provide that the PHA deliver a written explanation for any denied requests, describing why the request failed to meet established evaluation criteria, and describe how the parties will remedy misappropriation of funds. The written agreement will also include details about what types of activities are allowable. Check the latest HUD notice on Guidance on the Use of Tenant Participation Funds for full detail on the types of allowable activities. The written agreement will detail the specific activities that are allowed for your resident organization. There are also certain activities that resident organizations cannot undertake. In general, any activity outside the scope of the PHA policy, the written agreement, and HUD regulatory requirements about tenant participation funds and activities is not allowed. Unallowed expenses also include any activities prohibited by laws related to fair housing and non-discrimination. In addition, the Uniform Grant Guidance at 2 CFR 200 prohibits the use of federal funds, including tenant participation funds, for the following 4 types of activities. 1. Purchase of alcoholic beverages. 2. Entertainment, where the dedicated purpose of the event falls under the following categories: amusement, trips to theme parks, county fairs, etc. Diversions, theater, movies, sports events, etc. Social activities like parties, bowling nights, etc. 3. Any directly associated costs for the events in the categories above, like tickets to shows or sports events, meals, lodging, rentals, transportation, and gratuities. 4. Organized fundraising costs, including financial campaigns, solicitation of gifts and bequests, and similar expenses incurred to raise capital or obtain contributions, regardless of the purpose for which the funds will be used. Although funds cannot be used for the activities listed above, HUD encourages resident organizations and project owners to seek additional funds or partnerships to provide activities with beneficial outcomes to residents and communities. Resolving conflict between the resident organization and project owner. In general, the goal is for PHAs and project owners to support and work with the legitimate resident organizations at the covered properties. PHAs should understand that a conflict should not bar a resident organization from its ability to function or access allowable funds. In the event of conflict between the resident organization and the project owner, HUD strongly encourages residents and project owners to directly resolve questions concerning specific uses of resident participation funds. If a dispute over funding arises, the resident organization or project owner may refer the funding dispute to the contract administrator for intervention only after documented efforts at direct resolution have proven unsuccessful. As a reminder, the contract administrator is the voucher agency that executes a RAD PBV HAP contract with a project owner and administers the RAD PBV HAP contract. The contract administrator cannot be the same legal entity as the project owner, because a party may not enter into a contract with itself. More resources. For more information about what was covered in this video, be sure to read the latest PIH notice on the guidance on the use of tenant participation funds on the HUD website. Visit HUD Exchange to check out the Public Housing Resident Organizing and Participation Toolkit, which includes a sample written agreement and other useful resources. As always, reach out to your local field office with any specific questions.